So we're all excited about modular architecture, but I actually wanted to cover something which I think doesn't get discussed a lot when it comes to modular chains, and which is how the economics are going to look like, right? When you have all of these different layers working with each other, what are the economic models which we have at play, and what the incentive design is going to look like? Ultimately, what we've seen, so modular technology in general, when it comes to blockchains, is not something new. We've seen this in Web 2 as well. So what we've seen is that Web 2 software architecture was always monolithic. It was replaced with APIs and microservices. And ultimately, what we're seeing the same in Web 3 is that the monolithic chain architecture is also going to be replaced with model architecture, right? So at Mantle, for example, we built a modular chain. We've gone live with eigen layer data availability. We've taken the OP stack and turned that into a modular stack. And what we've also seen is that API-driven architecture led to like billions of dollars of value creation, and we expect the same to see, at least I expect, the same thing to happen with the model architecture as well. So let's try to look at some of the different layers of the blockchain and try and see what the incentive design is going to look like. So ultimately, on the execution layer, right, we've seen like a lot of interesting things happen. So if you've been following what some of the other layer ones have been doing, for example, Aptos came up with block STM, which is parallelized processing. There's also Arbitrum Stylus and Polygon Maiden. And what we've seen with different execution layers is that people have started thinking a little bit beyond EVM. So there was a time, or rather, I would just say over the last 18 months, we've seen that EVM has been the sort of execution layer of choice. But of course, now we've come to this point where we can also see that EVM is reaching a stage where either we optimize EVM or we look at a different kind of execution model where we can use possibly other languages, etc., to sort of write smart contracts, possibly do things more efficiently. And ultimately, there are a couple of ways of doing this. At the execution layer, you could possibly charge gas fees, accrue some yield to stakers. The moment you start to decentralize, you need to figure out some sort of economic model, and ultimately the value will lie in very optimized execution, and it has to be deterministic in nature as well. So if you can solve something like this in a decentralized manner, where you've got multiple execution environments all fighting for this piece of the pie, we could see some new interesting economic models come out. So I fully expect that with more and more VMs there, chains will not sort of work with only one VM. There could be multiple ones, depending on the kind of outcome you're looking for, whether it comes to gaming or DeFi. And ultimately, as long as it's fast, secure, and deterministic, and you can parallelize things, we're going to see some interesting economic models come out of the execution layer. Similarly, on settlement, right? So if you guys have been following what happened on Twitter, Anatoly posted something interesting where you could take Ethereum transactions and put those on Solana. I don't know if you want to do that, but it kind of gives you this interesting choice, right? So can we settle on other networks in the interim before we settle on Ethereum? Like these days, you must have seen so many different rollups are coming out on a daily basis, and which is great for the ecosystem, because that just means that the barrier to creating a chain and running a chain has reduced so much that everyone can have their own blockchain, which is great. But this also produces other challenges where we're going to see the block space on Ethereum, which was earlier crowded by transactions, is going to be crowded out by rollups. More and more state roots are going to eat up, and state roots, while you can optimize them, and we'll sort of get into that later, but ultimately, block space is again going to become a premium. And we need to figure out some interesting ways in which we can settle, we can solve for incentives, and we can achieve the kind of performance we need without like sacrificing security assumptions. So ultimately, you also have like this L3 app chain narrative going on these days. Like you can build your own app chain. I think so many people want to do that. Should they settle on Ethereum? Should you only settle on L2? Like how does, for example, the hyperchain model work on ZK Sync? Like some of these things have been discussed from a technology standpoint, but ultimately, what you really need to solve for is how do you create value of the token of the chain building on top. So all of these chains, which are L3s, all of them are going to have their own tokens. How is the underlying layer going to build value accrual for those tokens? Ultimately is going to be the main kicker. And of course, value lies sort of in derived security and faster finality, but along with ecosystem benefits. So for example, if you're building your own L3 chain, should you build it on ZK Sync? Should you do OP Collective? Like, how do you make that decision? And what we've seen time and time again is that the ability to get speed, execution, finality is something we've continuously become better at solving. But how do you help the ecosystem, and what does the ecosystem benefit look like? Ultimately, when you have all of these different sort of chains fighting with each other, you have Scroll, you have Polygon, zk-Sync, OP, Arbitrum, Nova, how are they going to help you design your ecosystem, and how they're going to help you create value for your own token, ultimately, in my opinion, is going to be the most important factor when you make this kind of a decision. And that's kind of why ecosystem benefits ultimately are going to be a very big factor. So for example, when we try to, at Mantle, talk to chains who want to build L3s, like the main conversation always is around ecosystem benefits. For example, liquidity, listing of tokens. And what else? Can we create markets for the tokens building on top? And if you go to the next layer, right, so data availability, of course, is now this hot new layer, right? We've got Celestia, we have Eigenlayer. So we went live with Eigenlayer, but we've been talking to Celestia for a while. There's also Polygon Avail. So many different like data availability solutions with different, let's say, security assumptions are also there. And we also have ETH restaking now as this new primitive, where you can take, for example, the economic value of a token, and you can use it for utility versus collateral-based yields. But ultimately, you again have to create utility for the chain token. So for example, in our case, what we liked about Eigenlayer is the fact that we could restake ETH and get security, but we could also take our own token and stake that on the data availability nodes, thereby creating yield and value for our token. And this is super important. So whenever you talk, like for example, about Celestia or Avail, luckily all the founders are here, so I can quiz them about these things. But how are you going to help my token? And where do the ecosystem benefits lie? So with more data availability solutions, ultimately the ability to solve token-related and value-related problems is going to become more important than any piece of technology out there. And we're just at the start of data availability. So I expect to see like more economic value sort of, or rather more like different approaches to economic value come out in the time to come. But this is like the main question I literally have when I talk to like data availability players out there. And if you go to the next layer, right, the consensus layer. Now, again, like consensus layer is a total war zone right now with ZK VMs, optimistic rollups, Arbitrum doing their own thing. The shared sequencer approach is also interesting, but again, the question is always the same. How do you create yield, right? So you have all of these ZK provers, you have like shared sequencers, shared bridges, fantastic. How does it help my token? Like, how does it create value for me? So I sometimes feel that we talk a lot about technology, we talk about EIP 4844, we talk about Workle trees to reduce proof size and optimize all of these things. But ultimately, and yeah, you can find gas fee extraction models and offer yield on decentralized designs, but how does it create value? And ultimately, these are the conversations we need to start having. So, I think we need to start looking a little bit beyond the technology and try and see how we can solve for value in these decentralized designs. I'm just going to keep it really short, and this is basically the last slide, but ultimately, technology will decide if we can build modular chains, but ultimately, the incentive design is what will decide how we do these things, how these execution layers come together, how these data availability layers come together, how the consensus layer comes together. So no value, no token equal to no bueno. And we need to really solve that. So anyway, thank you so much for listening. I just wanted to keep it really short and want to get more people start talking more about incentive designs. And I think the key of how we're going to implement all of these things lies in the token itself. So anyway, thank you guys. That's really it.
You want to maybe take some questions?
Oh, yeah. Do you guys have any questions? Anything you want me to cover about incentive design?
How are y'all thinking about basically the ossification of incentives, right? Eigenlayer, y'all kind of beat EigenDA before they even were out, right?
Yeah.
If that's part of your token model, and you get surprised by how the economics are working in 6 months and a year, does that put Mantle in a really hard position?
Not necessarily, because the core security assumption or the underlying infrastructure of how Eigenlayer is built is already set in stone, right? Because it's in the white paper. So it's kind of already decided upon. Now, the way to think about these problems is that the way you solve modularity with technology, you cannot really change that. So I'm actually against changing technology to fit the incentive model. What we need to do is take the infrastructure, like whatever the security assumptions are, whatever the restaking layer is, and what we need to do in that is bake economics into it. So the data availability nodes, which is securing data availability for many different chains, which is ultimately secured by the underlying eigenlayer restaking infrastructure, unless you can offer some token utility there, I feel chains may think twice before adopting this kind of sort of a data availability model, right? And similarly for Celestia, Celestia has got such an interesting model itself, right? Which is a little more optimistic in design. Polygon Avail is using Carde polynomial commitments. But ultimately, how they create value for the network's token and where those benefits lie are going to be like super important. So I don't think these companies or anybody else building this needs to change the infrastructure. They need to just figure out how to fit an incentive design into their underlying infrastructure. So EigenLayer is doing that using nodes. I think Celestia, I'm sure, will have some approach. I think Avail is going to be live possibly by Q1 of next year. So I look forward to seeing how they sort of solve these problems for networks. Does that cover the question?
Yeah, it's kind of more of a question about bit, but like how Mantle themselves are thinking about incentives, right? Because you're using that both on the gas fee context, and I guess if DA stakers are also staking.
So I would say that in terms of token, what I would say is that how we plan to structure it as an ecosystem token. So it'll be used for gas fees, it'll be used for infrastructure staking, it'll be used as the ecosystem token, it'll be used for governance, and then it will also be used in all the other protocols we're building, like the liquid staking derivatives protocol, which we also plan to roll out possibly by Q4 of this year. So the token will have utility across all of these sort of, you could say, infrastructure pieces. So that's kind of how we've designed the token. And whatever is produced in the future and whatever products we're going to make, we're going to ensure that we bake in some sort of incentive design.
Cool.
Yeah. All right. All right. In case you have any other questions, you can always just reach out to me on Twitter. It's first name, last name.